What happens when the gentlest man in Hollywood, a man who has endured unimaginable personal tragedy with grace, who has given away millions without seeking recognition, who has become a living symbol of humility and kindness in an industry known for ego and excess, is pushed so far beyond any reasonable boundary that he finally shatters decades of composure on live television? What happens when Keanu Reeves, the actor who never loses his cool, who responds to every provocation with quiet dignity, who has turned restraint into an art form, walks onto The View and encounters Joy Behar at her most aggressively cynical, her most determined to tear down everything good in the world? This isn't just another celebrity confrontation. This isn't another uncomfortable moment that gets forgotten by next week. This is the story of how Joy Behar systematically attacked not just Keanu's public image, but the very foundation of his character, questioning whether his legendary kindness is real, suggesting his generosity is calculated, insinuating that decades of selfless behavior is nothing more than an elaborate publicity stunt. And this is the story of how Keanu Reeves, after years of turning the other cheek, after decades of taking the high road while others took shots at him, finally reached his absolute breaking point and unleashed a fury so righteous, so controlled yet devastating, that it left Joy speechless, the studio in shock, and millions watching at home witnessing the most powerful moment in talk show history. By the time Keanu walked off that stage, the entire world would understand that even the kindest souls have limits, and when those limits are crossed, the explosion is more powerful than anyone could have imagined. The morning began with the kind of excitement that only comes when genuine Hollywood royalty is scheduled to appear. Keanu Reeves was coming to The View, and everyone from the production assistants to the studio audience to the hosts themselves buzzed with anticipation. This was Keanu John Wick, Neo from The Matrix, the actor whose off-screen kindness had become as legendary as his on-screen performances. Stories about him circulated constantly, giving up his seat on the subway, taking massive pay cuts so that crew members could be paid better, buying motorcycles for his stunt team, paying for strangers' meals at restaurants. He had become the internet's beloved symbol of genuine goodness in a cynical world. Keanu arrived at ABC Studios that morning with his characteristic low-key grace. He wore a simple black suit, nothing flashy, nothing designer, just clean and understated. His demeanor was exactly what everyone expected: calm, centered, radiating the kind of quiet contentment that comes from someone who has survived tragedy and come out the other side with his soul intact. He greeted everyone he encountered with genuine warmth: the security guard, the production assistants, the makeup team. Not the performative friendliness of someone trying to maintain an image, but the authentic kindness of someone who actually sees and values other human beings. What Keanu didn't know, what he couldn't have anticipated, was that Joy Behar had spent the previous evening preparing for this interview with a very specific agenda. She had been reading articles questioning Keanu's authenticity, conspiracy theories suggesting his kindness was a carefully orchestrated PR campaign, cynical takes suggesting that no one could be genuinely that good without ulterior motives. And Joy, whose entire career had been built on skepticism and provocative questioning, had decided that this interview would be her chance to expose what she had convinced herself was the truth: that Keanu Reeves was too good to be true, and therefore must be fake. The View set glowed with its familiar lighting as Keanu made his entrance to thunderous applause. The studio audience rose as one, clapping and cheering with an enthusiasm that went beyond typical celebrity worship. This was genuine affection for someone they believed represented the best of humanity. Keanu waved modestly, his slight smile radiating humility as he took his seat. He looked almost uncomfortable with the intensity of the positive attention, which only made the audience love him more. "Welcome to The View, Keanu," Whoopi Goldberg said warmly, her voice carrying the respect of one Hollywood icon acknowledging another. "It's truly wonderful to have you here with us." "Thank you so much for having me," Keanu replied, his voice characteristically soft and genuine, completely lacking the affected quality that often marks celebrity speech. "It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you." The interview began exactly as it should have: pleasant, engaging, substantive. They discussed his latest film project, and Keanu spoke thoughtfully about the character's journey and the collaborative process of filmmaking. They asked about his passion for motorcycles, and he lit up talking about the freedom of the open road and the engineering beauty of the machines. Someone mentioned his well-documented acts of kindness, and Keanu deflected with typical modesty, uncomfortable being praised for what he clearly considered just basic human decency. Throughout these opening minutes, Keanu answered every question with thoughtfulness and humility, never trying to dominate the conversation, never steering it toward promoting himself too aggressively. He was exactly what everyone expected him to be: grounded, genuine, almost unnaturally humble for someone of his stature. But Joy Behar had been unusually quiet during these opening exchanges, and anyone familiar with her knew that silence from Joy was rarely a good sign. She sat back in her chair with a faint smirk playing at her lips, tapping her pen rhythmically against her notes, eyes fixed on Keanu with an intensity that suggested she was waiting, calculating, preparing to strike. Finally, cutting directly across a story Keanu was telling about working with young actors on his latest film, Joy made her move. "You know, Keanu," she said, her voice carrying that particular edge that signals incoming attack, "I have to ask you something that's been bothering me for a while now." The energy in the studio shifted instantly and unmistakably. The other co-hosts exchanged quick, worried glances. The audience, which had been relaxed and engaged, suddenly tensed. And Keanu, mid-sentence, stopped speaking and turned his full attention to Joy, his expression still pleasant but now more focused, more alert. "Of course," he said simply, his voice carrying no defensiveness, just openness. "What would you like to know?" Joy leaned forward, and that predatory smile spread wider across her face, the expression of someone who believes they're about to expose a fraud and is looking forward to it. "Well," she began, her voice dripping with skepticism, "you've built this entire image around being this impossibly nice guy, this humble actor who gives away millions of dollars, who helps strangers on the street, who turns down higher salaries so crew members can be paid more. But I have to wonder, and I think a lot of people wonder this even if they won't say it out loud, is any of it actually real? Or is it all just the most elaborate, brilliant public relations campaign in Hollywood history?" The studio fell into absolute silence. The kind of silence that feels alive, that presses against your eardrums, that makes the mechanical hum of cameras suddenly audible. This wasn't the kind of question guests typically faced on The View, and certainly not someone as universally beloved as Keanu Reeves. Keanu's expression didn't change dramatically, but those who knew how to read subtle shifts in body language could see it: the slight tightening around his eyes, the barely perceptible straightening of his spine, the way his hands, which had been resting casually in his lap, now pressed together with just a bit more tension. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice still controlled and calm. "Could you clarify what you mean by that?" Joy wasn't backing down. If anything, the slight defensive note in Keanu's voice seemed to energize her, to confirm her suspicion that she had touched a nerve. "Oh, come on, Keanu," she pressed, leaning even further forward. "You're asking me to believe that a Hollywood actor, someone who has made hundreds of millions of dollars, who operates in the most cynical, calculating industry on earth, is genuinely this selfless person? That there's no calculation behind all these good deeds? That your whole modest, humble, aw shucks thing isn't just another performance, maybe your best performance?" The other hosts looked genuinely uncomfortable now. Whoopi cleared her throat meaningfully, clearly wanting to steer the conversation back to safer territory, to salvage what was rapidly becoming a hostile interrogation. But Joy was just getting warmed up. "I mean, let's be realistic here," she continued, her voice getting sharper, more aggressive with each word. "Normal people don't have photographers mysteriously showing up to capture their acts of kindness. Normal people don't have their good deeds become viral marketing campaigns perfectly timed with their movie releases. So forgive me if I'm a little skeptical of Saint Keanu and his too-good-to-be-true image." Keanu sat completely still for a moment, processing what he'd just heard. The man who had remained composed through unspeakable personal tragedy, who had handled decades of fame with remarkable grace, was now being accused on national television of fabricating his entire character for profit. When he finally spoke, his voice was still controlled, but there was something different about it now, something harder beneath the softness. "Joy," he said carefully, "I understand that skepticism is part of your job as an interviewer, but I think you're crossing into territory that's not just unfair, it's cruel." Joy actually laughed. Not a chuckle, not a nervous deflection, but a sharp, cutting laugh that conveyed pure dismissive contempt. "Cruel?" she repeated, as if the word itself was absurd. "Oh, please, I'm asking legitimate questions that any good journalist should be asking. You want to talk about cruel? Cruel is manipulating people's emotions for profit. Cruel is building an entirely fake persona to sell movie tickets and magazine covers. Cruel is making people believe in something that doesn't exist. That was the moment. That was when something fundamental shifted in Keanu's eyes. The man who had absorbed loss that would destroy most people, who had endured decades of invasive questions and invasive cameras with endless patience, was finally approaching his limit. You want to talk about manipulation, Joy? Keanu's voice was still quiet, but now it carried a weight, an intensity that made everyone in the studio lean forward involuntarily. Let's talk about manipulation. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Keanu Reeves, the man who had spent his entire career avoiding confrontation, who was famous for deflecting criticism with grace, was now staring directly at Joy Behar, with an intensity that made the entire studio hold its collective breath. You sit at this table every single day, Keanu continued, his voice gaining strength and clarity with each word, and you tear people down for entertainment. You take someone's genuine attempt to do good in the world, and you twist it into something cynical and calculated because that's what gets ratings, that's what keeps people watching. Controversy sells, doesn't it, Joy? Joy's smirk faltered slightly, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. I'm a journalist, Keanu, she said defensively. I ask hard questions. If you can't handle that level of scrutiny, maybe you shouldn't be doing promotional interviews. Hard questions? Keanu leaned forward now, his legendary calm exterior finally beginning to crack like ice under too much pressure. You want to ask hard questions? Then ask me about the work. Ask me about the craft of acting, about the stories we're trying to tell, about the collaborative process of filmmaking. But don't you dare. Don't you dare sit there and question whether my grief is real, whether my desire to help people is genuine, whether losing my best friend, my daughter, my sister, somehow transformed me into a better person, or just taught me to be a better actor. The mention of his devastating personal losses sent a visible shockwave through the panel. Even Joy seemed momentarily taken aback, her eyes widening slightly. But she recovered quickly, her defensive instincts and ego kicking in with renewed force. Now you're being dramatic, Joy shot back, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I never mentioned your personal tragedies. I'm talking about your public image, your brand. There's a difference between those things. No, Joy, there isn't, Keanu said, and his voice was rising now for the first time, not shouting, but projecting with power, filling the studio in a way that made everyone sit up straighter. You can't separate the two when you're attacking someone's fundamental character. When you call someone's kindness fake, when you suggest their generosity is calculated for publicity, you're not attacking their brand. You're attacking everything they are. You're telling the world that goodness doesn't exist, that every decent act must have an ulterior motive, that cynicism is somehow more honest than believing the best of people. Sonny Hostin, clearly sympathetic to Keanu and increasingly uncomfortable with Joy's relentless attack, tried to intervene. Maybe we should... No, Keanu said firmly, his eyes never leaving Joy's face, his intensity increasing rather than diminishing. Let her finish. She clearly has more to say about my supposed manipulation of public perception. Please, Joy, by all means enlighten all of us. Tell us how helping a stranded motorist change a tire at 2 a.m. is a publicity stunt. Explain how giving away most of my Matrix salary to the special effects and costume design teams was just savvy business. Clarify for everyone watching how privately paying for friends' cancer treatments for years without anyone knowing until it leaked accidentally is somehow calculated marketing. Joy's face was reddening now, her body language becoming defensive even as her words remained aggressive. You see, she said, her voice getting shriller. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You've got a list ready to go. You know exactly which good deeds to mention when someone challenges you. That's not genuine spontaneous kindness, that's crisis management. That's damage control. The audience began to murmur uncomfortably. Some were clearly disturbed by Joy's continued attacks on someone they admired. Others seemed shocked that anyone would be this aggressive toward a guest, particularly one as universally respected as Keanu. But Keanu wasn't done. Years of restraint, of biting his tongue, of taking the high road while others took shots at him, was beginning to crack wide open. You want to know what actual crisis management looks like, Joy? Keanu stood up from his chair, a move so unexpected that several people in the studio actually gasped. He didn't stand aggressively, didn't tower over anyone, but the simple act of rising made his words carry even more weight. Crisis management is when someone like you gets called out for being unnecessarily cruel on national television, and instead of apologizing, instead of showing even an ounce of basic human decency, you double down. You attack harder. You justify your cruelty by calling it journalism. That's crisis management. I am not being cruel, Joy insisted, but her voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. She was starting to realize, perhaps, that she had badly miscalculated that attacking Keanu Reeves' fundamental character was not going to play out the way she'd imagined. Honest? Keanu's laugh was sharp and bitter, a sound so foreign coming from him that it seemed to shock everyone who heard it, including himself. You want to talk about honesty? Here's honest, Joy. You're not a journalist. Journalists seek truth. You seek controversy. You don't care about facts, you care about reactions. You don't want to inform people, you want to upset them, because upset people keep watching. And watching people generate ratings. And ratings make money. Whoopi tried desperately to intervene, to somehow salvage what was rapidly becoming one of the most uncomfortable moments in The View's history. Keanu, maybe we should... No, Whoopi, Keanu said, and his voice, while respectful toward her, carried an authority that wouldn't be denied. With all due respect, I'm not finished here. He turned back to Joy, who was now shifting uncomfortably in her seat. Her earlier predatory confidence completely evaporated. You want to question my motives? Fine. Let's question yours. How much of your salary comes from creating exactly this kind of drama? How much of your career has been built on tearing down people who can't or won't fight back? And when someone finally does fight back, when someone finally calls you out for what you really are, you hide behind the label of journalists like it gives you permission to be heartless. Joy's face was now completely flushed, and she was gripping her pen so tightly her knuckles had gone white. How dare you lecture me about journalism? She said, her voice trembling with either rage or wounded pride or both. You're an actor. You pretend to be other people for a living. You play make-believe for millions of dollars. And you pretend to be a decent human being for a living. Keanu shot back without hesitation, the words landing like physical blows. At least I'm honest about what I do being pretend. At least I don't disguise cruelty as truth-seeking. The studio was dead silent now, every person frozen by the intensity of what they were witnessing. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of this unprecedented confrontation. This wasn't the Keanu Reeves the world knew, the gentle, humble, endlessly patient soul. This was someone who had finally been pushed beyond his breaking point. Joy made one desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. You know what, Keanu? You're actually proving my point perfectly right now. The mask is coming off, isn't it? The real you is coming out, and surprise, surprise, it's not nearly as nice as you pretend to be. That was when Keanu's voice dropped to almost a whisper, but somehow it carried more power, more devastating force than if he had been shouting. The real me, Joy, he said, each word deliberate and weighted with years of pain, is someone who has buried more people he loved than anyone should ever have to bury. The real me is someone who wakes up every single day and consciously chooses to try to make the world just a little bit better instead of a little bit worse. The real me is someone who genuinely believes that kindness matters, that helping people matters, that treating others with dignity and respect actually means something. He paused, letting the words sink in, his eyes boring into Joy's with an intensity that made her look away. And the real you, he continued, his voice still quiet but absolutely devastating, is someone who just spent the last 15 minutes on national television trying to convince millions of people that none of those things are real. That goodness is fake. That kindness is calculated. That the only honest way to live is with the same bitter cynicism that clearly defines your worldview. The words hit Joy like physical blows. For the first time in the entire confrontation, she seemed genuinely speechless. The woman who always had a comeback, who never backed down from any fight, who prided herself on being unflappable, was sitting there with her mouth slightly open, unable to form words. But Keanu wasn't finished. decades of restraint, of taking the high road, of absorbing attacks with grace, had finally given way to something more powerful, righteous fury delivered with devastating precision. You know what the really tragic part is, Joy? Keanu continued, his voice still carrying that quiet intensity that demanded attention. You could use your platform for something actually meaningful. You could lift people up. You could ask questions that genuinely help people understand the world better, that inspire them to be better. But instead, you consistently choose to be a bully. And not just any bully. A bully with a microphone and an audience of millions watching you weaponize cynicism and call it honesty. Joy finally found her voice, but it was shakier than before, defensive and wounded. I am not a bully, she insisted. I ask tough questions that need to be asked. If you can't handle... Stop. Keanu's single word, delivered with such quiet authority, actually made Joy stop mid-sentence, her mouth closing involuntarily. Just stop. You've said enough. Actually, you said enough about 10 minutes ago, but you kept going because that's what you do. You don't know when to stop. You don't recognize when you've crossed the line from legitimate questioning into character assassination, from journalism into cruelty. Sunny tried once more to diffuse the situation, her voice gentle and pleading. Maybe we should take a commercial break and... No, Keanu said firmly, still standing, still projecting that unexpected power. We're going to finish this conversation right here, right now, because the people watching at home deserve to see how this ends. They deserve to see what happens when someone finally stands up to the playground bully with a television show. Joy's defensive anger flared back to life, her voice rising to match Keanu's intensity. Playground bully? Are you serious right now? I'm doing my job. I'm holding celebrities accountable. I'm asking the questions that the public wants answered, but is too polite to ask directly. Whose questions, Joy? Keanu's voice grew stronger, more passionate, channeling years of accumulated frustration. Who exactly is demanding that you question whether kindness is real? Who is begging you to tear down people who are genuinely trying to do good in the world? Because I'll tell you who's not asking for that skepticism, the people who directly benefit from that kindness. The crew members who got to send their children to college, because I shared my salary with them instead of keeping it all. The cancer patients who received treatment they couldn't afford because someone cared enough to help quietly, without publicity. The stranded families who got home safely because someone stopped to help when everyone else drove by. None of them are asking you to question whether that help was genuine. But the public has a right to know, Joy started. But Keanu cut her off immediately. The public has a right to know the truth, Joy. Not your cynical interpretation twisted to fit your worldview. The public has a right to accurate information, not your bitter commentary masquerading as hard-hitting journalism. And the public has a right to witness good things happening in the world without someone immediately appearing to tell them it's all fake, all calculated, all performance. The other co-hosts sat frozen, exchanging helpless glances. They were witnessing television history being made, and none of them knew how to stop it, or even if they should try. Joy made one final desperate attempt to regain the upper hand, to turn the tables back in her favor. You know what I think, Keanu? She said, her voice carrying forced confidence that didn't quite mask her underlying uncertainty. I think you're having this massive emotional outburst, precisely because you know I'm right. I think you're this angry because someone finally saw through your carefully constructed act, and you can't handle being exposed as just another Hollywood phony. That was it. That was the moment when Keanu Reeves, the man who had remained calm through his girlfriend's death, through his daughter's stillbirth, through his best friend's overdose, through decades of unimaginable loss, finally exploded with full force. Exposed? His voice boomed through the studio, loud enough to make several people physically jump in their seats. You want to talk about exposure? Let's talk about what you've actually exposed here today, Joy. He took a step closer to the table, and his physical presence combined with the power in his voice made Joy actually lean back in her chair. You've exposed yourself as someone who is so fundamentally miserable, so profoundly bitter, so utterly incapable of believing that genuine goodness exists in this world, that you have to systematically destroy anyone who proves you wrong. You've exposed yourself as someone who mistakes cynicism for wisdom, cruelty for courage, destruction for honesty. Joy tried to interrupt, tried to mount some kind of defense, but Keanu's momentum was unstoppable now. "No," he said forcefully. "You've had your turn to talk. You've had your turn to attack, to question every motive, to tear down everything good. Now it's my turn." His voice was still loud, but controlled a controlled explosion of decades of accumulated restraint finally finding release. "You've exposed yourself as someone who genuinely believes that cynicism is the same thing as intelligence, that being cruel somehow makes you honest, that tearing people down is equivalent to building yourself up. You've shown everyone watching that you would rather destroy something beautiful than admit that beauty can actually exist without ulterior motives." The studio was absolutely electric now. The audience sat in stunned silence. But the energy was palpable shock, discomfort, but also something else. A sense that they were witnessing something important, something real, breaking through the usual polish of television. "And you know what else you've exposed, Joy?" Keanu continued, his voice dropping back to that dangerously quiet level that somehow carried more power than shouting. "You've exposed the fact that you're exactly the kind of person who makes good people want to stop being good. You're that voice in people's heads that says, 'Don't help that stranger, people will think you're showing off.' You're the reason people hesitate before being generous, because they know someone like you will immediately question their motives. You're the poison that makes people choose cynicism over kindness." Joy was visibly shaken now, but she made one final, desperate attempt to salvage something. "This is rich," she said, her voice cracking slightly, coming from someone who's having a complete public meltdown on live television. "Is this the real Keanu Reeves? Is this the calm, centered, spiritually enlightened person you want people to believe you are?" Keanu stood to his full height, and when he spoke, his voice was absolutely steady again, but it carried a weight that seemed to physically fill the studio. "You're absolutely right, Joy," he said with devastating calm. "This is the real me. This is someone who has spent his entire adult life trying to be kind, trying to help others, trying to leave the world slightly better than he found it, and who finally reached his absolute limit when confronted with someone, determined to convince millions of people that kindness is a lie." He paused, looking around at the other hosts, then back at Joy, who seemed to have shrunk in her chair. "This is someone who has lost everyone he's ever truly loved, and still chooses to love. This is someone who has been knocked down by life more times than anyone should have to endure, and still gets up every morning trying to lift others up. And yes, this is someone who finally got angry when faced with a person whose apparent life's work is ensuring that no one else gets lifted up either." He reached for his jacket, his movements calm and deliberate now. "You wanted the real me, Joy? Here I am. I'm someone who believes that the world already has more than enough people tearing each other down, and it desperately needs more people trying to build each other up. I'm someone who thinks that when you have a platform, when you have an audience, when you have influence, you have a moral responsibility to use it for good rather than destruction." He slipped his jacket on with quiet dignity. "And I'm someone who believes that what you've done here today, what you apparently do on this show regularly, is the precise opposite of good." The silence that followed felt eternal. Joy's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. The other hosts sat frozen. The audience remained absolutely still, barely breathing. Keanu picked up his phone from the table, his movements unhurried and controlled. "I think I'm done here," he said quietly. "Thank you for having me on the show. I genuinely hope the people watching got something valuable out of this conversation, even if it wasn't what anyone expected or wanted." He started walking toward the edge of the set, then stopped and turned back to Joy one final time. His expression had softened slightly, not with forgiveness, but with something that looked almost like compassion. "Joy," he said gently, "I genuinely hope that someday you find whatever it is you're looking for by tearing other people down. Because from where I'm standing, from everything I just witnessed here, it doesn't look like it's making you very happy. And that, more than anything else you've said or done today, makes me sad for you." As Keanu walked off the set, not storming, not dramatic, just walking with the same quiet dignity he'd entered with the studio, remained in absolute, stunned silence. The cameras kept rolling, capturing Joy Behar sitting at the table completely speechless, her face pale, while the man she had tried to expose had instead revealed something far more uncomfortable. The emptiness at the heart of weaponized cynicism. The world had wanted to see if Keanu Reeves was real, and they got their answer, just not in the way Joy Behar had planned.